It's not that we don't want to change. I mean, this is the argument they always make is that we're against change, we're against progress. And what we're against is bad development. It's not a choice between accepting this 12-story tower or being against progress. It's being for good change and against bad change. But they will always twist it so that we're NIMBYs and we're against all change. It's not true at all. In all the meetings I've been to, all the meetings I've arranged, all the meetings I've spoken at, a huge majority of the people here have recognized that our population will go up, have recognized that some parts of our neighborhood will change, and all they want is the right to determine how it changes and the rate of change. Well, that was always going to be the issue, was how much they would listen and how those workshops were reported out. That's always, you can take a cynic's view that they'll hear you but not listen, and they'll produce simply the document that they want to produce. The first issue with the Emerging Directories document was that they had listened to us about the arts and culture, the heritage, the parks, and that was reflected, I think, fairly well in the Emerging Directions document. However, they came up with all these rezonings that you just talked about that we had never discussed for 1 minute in any of the workshops. And so it was a huge shock to see this massive rezoning all over the neighborhood that had never been discussed with us.
I don't think the plan really accurately reflected the interests of the community. The plan may have been a good plan citywide. The city is committed to and probably should increase density in a number of neighborhoods, but the people actually living there were not comfortable with the amount of density increase, nor were they comfortable with the specific plans. Too many high-rises, too much density, not enough attention to the single family and small community feeling of the neighborhood. So the city may have listened and done extensive consultation, but I don't think in the end they captured what the community wanted.
It was a fairly common cited thing or feedback in all the consultations, the well-lauded consultations, that the community felt that they needed more density. Well, to put it another way, they wanted new and more housing, and the only way to do that, because there's no empty land in Grandview-Woodlands, is to create some sort of density. I think the challenge is that our planning staff heard the word density and they translated that into height, and they are not the same thing, right? And this is one of the challenges of community consultation, is you say something and then I might hear something else, right? Like both of us have a picture in our mind and trying to figure out exactly. Obviously that picture was not 11, 19-story towers at Commercial and Broadway, right? Even though the community wants more housing, obviously they want it in a different form.
We in Grandview had written a long letter to Jackson while he was preparing his report, giving a number of recommendations as to how we wanted to see it progress in the future. One of which was a joint management committee. That they rejected that idea, but they replaced it with what they called a citizens' assembly, but with no definition whatsoever. And so since September, and it's now the end of February, we've been humming and hawing. They've been trying to think about how to get this citizens' assembly going.
Right, take part in it. But I think what a lot of people are fearful of is this is going to be, a group that is selected by the city based on, certain conditions, and that it sort of limits, it frames the discussion in a way that doesn't allow for other visions or competing ideas about what the neighborhood should be to sort of flow organically, and that it will be controlled in a way that is sort of narrow in scope, which I think a lot of people are very wary of, and that was primarily the thing that eroded a lot of trust through this process, was this agenda seems to be getting pushed, but it's certainly not coming from the neighborhood. And a lot of people that fear that housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable in that neighborhood.
And I think if nothing else, people are learning a lot more about their community. I remember sitting in a room with Jack King and a few other people, and I said, you know, how many renters are on the board of Grandview-Woodland Area Council, GWAC, and he said, well, we've got a few. And I said, well, how many is a few, right, out of 14 members or whatever they had on the board? He said, well, maybe one. And I was like, this is a community where 65% of people rent, and a lot of them at the lowest end of the rental spectrum. So how can you have a resident association that says it represents the community if it so clearly doesn't?
Did we go through this one? Apparently no.
My God.
Interesting, they put netting on the right side of the gable and not the left. Does that mean birds only want to nest on the west side? Not the east side?
This is ornithological detail.
The Malkin connector, which,
yeah.
if that happens, that's, I think, the biggest threat to the nature of
It
this
is.
place.
It's not getting the towers in the foreground that we
It's
want.
the Emily Carr, and the campus is here.
Right.
The new development called Campus, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Isn't that next door? And Jim Pattison owns all his grocery warehouses on the north side. He owns all under different names. It's amazing. I found out once. It's like, oh, they own this, and they own this, and they own this. Really?
Yeah. Well, I'm on the city committee that's looking at the development of these lands, and we last met in June. You know, since then we've had.
June? Yeah, that means 2013.
I think it was a $2 billion proposal since then, and we haven't met to discuss it. For anyone who knows Grandview-Woodland, they know that we are a low-rise, essentially family-oriented neighborhood. It's mainly houses. A lot of those houses are broken up into very affordable suites, and especially along Nanaimo and First, both of which are slated in the plan to be essentially replaced with stacked townhouses and row houses.
No, what we need is the housing, right? Like, that's what we're desperately in need of. A lot of the housing pressure in Vancouver comes from quite a few years of not building housing. We need to build 1,500 new units of rental housing every single year just to keep up with demand. We had, in 2008, not a single unit of rental housing was built in the city, and in the decade prior to that, very little was built each year. So we not only have to build 1,500 each year now to keep up with demand, we also have to figure out how to build 15,000 units that weren't built over a decade. So yeah, we desperately need housing. And I know a lot of what's getting built is condos, and that's the challenge of us not having the regulatory authority of the federal or provincial government to ensure that it absolutely is rental being built. The federal government used to do a rental tax credit, and that lasted up until the early 90s. If you look at the graph of when rental housing was built, the minute that tax credit went out, the graph just, it's like watching a ledge in the ocean. It just sort of drops off into the abyss. So we take the tools that we have to try and incent rental housing, and one of them is building condos so that it helps to pay for the rental housing. Some of the condos get rented out, but ultimately we're hoping to attract the federal and provincial governments back into the business of ensuring that residents of Canada and British Columbia are housed adequately and affordably.
The question, what kind of cities do we want to live in? How do we want our cities to be? Cannot be divorced from the question of what kind of people we want to be. And it is that mutual constitution of the city and who we are and what we are that is something which is, I think, again, very important to reflect upon.
This is The City, an hour dedicated to a critical discussion of urban issues. This is The City here on CITR 101.9 FM, CITR.ca, and we're syndicated on CJSF 90.1 FM, and that the BC government has introduced back-to-work legislation in an effort to end the ongoing strike by container truck drivers at Port Metro Vancouver. What's the public, what's the community actually getting out of this? Is it affordable housing? Is it, daycare space? Is it, more park space? Is it, generally lower rents, or is it quite the opposite? And I think that's what I hear from people, and especially with this plan. I would say that that's what we're seeing across the city, and I think, picking up on what people are saying as well, that's also what I'm hearing too.
The neighborhood needs to meet the city halfway and recognize that change is going to happen, and increasing density is going to happen in that neighborhood. The way transit works and the way the city needs to develop in a more sustainable way, makes that a perfect hub for increased density. But how that happens is, should have a lot of community input.
Well, I think especially with Grandview-Woodlands and the Broadway commercial area, I would argue that it's already a transit-oriented development. So for me, it's a question of for whom is this sustainable transit-oriented development for? Upzoning that land and building a new type of development will raise land values by upzoning, and in return, rents go up. So this is what academics and also activists call gentrification. Land values increase. How does that cost get then downloaded? Rents rise. So landlords pay for that through extracting more rent. It's not a mystery, and it should be sort of demystified. And the city needs to acknowledge that process. I mean, I think to some extent they have with the Downtown Eastside Area Plan. But again, that's a question that I think back to this idea of TOD or transit-oriented development. I think we need to ask, well, is this actually, are we achieving this idea of social sustainability or social justice? And what does it mean to be sustainable? Does it mean you're sustainable because now only rich people can afford to live in a neighborhood? Is that a sustainable city? And I think that's a pretty fundamental question. So.
I think we all understand, I don't know, Paul, I think most people get now that towers just aren't going to be on. So there can be transit-oriented density and development, but it doesn't have to come in a tower form.
How do you, I was wondering how would that look? Instead of do you just kind of cut those towers in half, have mid-rise?
That's the debate.
Spread it out?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is every floor you cut off a tower, then you have to spread that out somewhere in the community. I would say though, I mean, having lived there, it's the one community that didn't get super upset about having a shelter there when we opened up one of the heat shelters, the emergency action shelters. So there's a lot of compassion in that community. There's a lot of understanding. A lot of people either are very low income or they have been recently, and they understand what it's like to be in that position, and therefore they understand the dire need for housing. Figuring out how to negotiate that so that everybody's needs are met, and then we can layer in the wants, is going to be the challenge of the next stage of planning, but impossible to do if you can't get more voices at the table that represent a broader spectrum of views in the community.
To me, every spot zoning, every change in zoning is a breach of the trust that the residents and the purchasers of houses in the neighborhood have with the city. Because let's say you bought a house on Napier Street today, you spent $1 million on it in an RT zone neighborhood, and then suddenly a developer comes by and wants to develop a 10-story apartment block on the lot next to yours, and the city gives him that ability to do that, then that is a real breach of trust with the person who's just bought the house for $1 million, I think. It's even more of a breach of the social contract with the person who's lived there for 50 years. What will be the effect of getting rid of $700 apartments and putting in $1,500 a month apartments? So it's hard to say. I guess it must. If there's enough of them, that will certainly change the nature of the neighborhood. The biggest change we're facing right now is gentrification and the increase in rents. That's what will change the drive more than anything. Is not building form. I think it will be the type of businesses that operate here that can afford the rent.
Do you think the city can do more?
But we've lived through that change. 30 years ago, there were about 30 restaurants. Now there are more than 100. So we've managed to absorb that. But as the rents go up, what are we going to put in here instead? I don't know. We're seeing a few fancy stores go in, a few fancy boutiques. I guess we'll see more of that. The danger is that the small restaurants will be taken over by chains. That's a real danger because the chains can afford the rents. I think that's a bigger danger than towers here, to be frank.